Recently, we just did a video on a thread from Jacob Navok, a former director of business at Square Enix Holdings, who has reported to two of its previous CEOs, that being Yoichi Wada and Yosuke Matsuda. In that thread, he gave us a ton of knowledge on the realities of AAA game development from a business perspective and where Final Fantasy currently is. And today, he's responded to many people's questions and given even more incredibly valuable knowledge. This Twitter thread is absolutely gold, crucial to really understanding where Final Fantasy and Square Enix at large is. So if you find that valuable, important information to you, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. So this is what Jacob's follow-up thread has had to say. Many thanks to everyone who shared or retweeted my dive into Square Enix's financial results. I noticed a few questions that I'll respond to here. First, I've seen questions about how to build games cheaper or set budgets based on smaller sales figures. It's important to understand that game budgeting is an art rather than a science. I have rarely seen a game stick to its budget. Through the creative process, you may go back into pre-production 3 times or throw out entire game directions, or find out that the gameplay sucks, or that testing means that you need to completely rewrite the game mode that you are working on. This is how games like Helldivers 2 go on for an estimated 3 years of development to 7+ years. When working on a game, you kind of really don't know right away whether it's going to be fun, especially in these early stages. In your head and on paper, things always sound great. Then you start working on a prototype, you start implementing things, and you may even get midway through a certain point and realize that actually this game kind of sucks and we need to tweak things and we need to change things. If you set that budget early and don't leave yourself any room for flexibility, you will very often find yourself running out of budget. Jacob then continues, linear paths do not exist for game dev. Making a game is not like painting a picture with Bob Ross, or like making a movie, which, by the way, go well over time and budget all the time. My old boss, Yoichi Wada, who ran Square Enix for over a decade, used to say that games are the most complex form of mass consumer software. Most consumer software like Word or Slack can only run on a CPU or even in a browser. Only games require GPUs, a specialized complex piece of hardware to be able to run. There's a reason that Apple showed off their iPhone 15 last year by promoting games like Resident Evil and Death Stranding being able to run on them. Today, ChatGPT and other language learning models can lay claim to being more complex than games, again in terms of mass consumer software, given that they require a huge number of even more complex GPUs than consoles run. But the point I am making is that games are exceptional relative to most other forms of software. In sum, games are the most technically complex pieces of software, unlike most other software, also require significant investment in story, art, interactive design, and network design, and dev will always go wrong before it goes right. This last sentence here that says, dev will always go wrong before it goes right, this is true. I know that this might be a harsh reality for some people who have never worked on a game project before. Things will always go badly before they go right. It's an unfortunate reality of game dev. And again, you're not just making a piece of software, right? Any other software, basically, if it works, and the user experience is good, then kind of in an objective sense, it's a great piece of software. It's a tool that does its job appropriately, and you can objectively measure how well it does its job. A video game can be a wonderful piece of software, but can still be a terrible piece of art. And that is the struggle that we have here. How do you make a good piece of art that's also a good piece of software? You're doing both at the same time whenever you're creating a game, and that is the unique challenge that video game developers face that other art mediums don't really have to contend with. It's difficult to say, but your budget has to be flexible to account for we may not get things right the first time, the second time, or even the third. And Jacob illustrates this point quite well when he says, when a producer comes to you and says, sorry, this isn't working, we're going to need 12 more months to redo, then retest half of the game, you can't say, sorry, you're over budget, ship it as it is, at a publisher like Square Enix, which, by the way, we've had publishers who do say, go ahead and ship it as it is, and you guys know exactly how that turns out. A 10% additional investment in time or budget will be the difference between a 5 out of 10 game and a 9 out of 10 game, and generate millions of units more sold. And there is no world where everything in a creative product always goes the way it is intended. FF12 and FF15 both had a change of director, Matsuno Tabata, during development. FF15 famously took a decade to make and started off as an FF13 spin-off. You cannot dictate devs, be more efficient. You have to be able to know which creatives to give control, when to cut your losses, and to have cash reserves to pivot. As technology changes, games tend to change. There are huge technology strides in just 2 or 3 years in our industry. Forget 5 years. In the 90s, FF7 had as many myriad things to do as FF16, and also pushed the edge of computer graphics, taking up all of the CGI capacity of Japan at that time. A story its developers love to repeat to me over drinks. I would actually argue that OG FF7 had more of a myriad of things to do than Final Fantasy 16, but I digress. FF7 was done faster because the technology was simpler and the bleeding edge graphics at a far lower fidelity. Engineers have not gotten less skilled, and artists have not gotten worse at their craft in the ensuing decades. Everyone has gotten better. It is the bar that is set higher because of what it takes to achieve fidelity. That's true. You know, programmers have only gotten better and things have only gotten easier to program. Developing with Unreal Engine has made game development incredibly fast. But again, it's not about all these tools making things faster. It's just that the bar also gets raised each time. And it gets raised so much higher that it begins to cost an insane amount and take an absurd amount of time. And one thing about the original Final Fantasy VII in particular is that they were still doing rewrites almost up until the very end, tweaking the story, fine-tuning it, and making sure that it was really solid. That is something that you absolutely, positively cannot do in modern AAA game development. You have to think about motion capture, voice acting, all of these other elements that are extremely crucial to the modern AAA game, and they take tons of time and preparation. If I recall correctly, Kitase wasn't even aware of Zack as a character until he was playtesting the final build of FF7, because Nojima and Nomura were able to come up with him that quickly and implement him into the game. But that's an example of just how fluid they were able to change things back then compared to now, where once you come up with stuff in pre-production, you kind of want to be locked into that once you go into full production, because making any sort of massive tweaks to the script or the story can be incredibly hard to account for later. He then says, to that end, you cannot make a 20-hour Final Fantasy, a AA Final Fantasy, and have it still be Final Fantasy. You can make an amazing 100-hour AA game like Octopath, or you can make an incredible 20-hour AAA game like Alan Wake 2, which by the way did not recoup its dev cost on launch. But the FF brand is supposed to be a spectacular 100+ hour AAA journey. That is what the brand means. Anything less will get terrible reactions from consumers. So if you want to make cheaper, shorter, lower quality products, you need to use a different brand. You know, part of me thinks that people would be okay with something like a more stylized Final Fantasy game that isn't using the latest cutting-edge AAA graphics, but then also part of me thinks that since Final Fantasy VII, that has become so core to the DNA of Final Fantasy, arguably since Final Fantasy VI, you know, the way Final Fantasy VI graphics were presented, it was the most cutting edge thing on Super Nintendo, aside from Chrono Trigger, which was also Square Enix. I also think about titles like Final Fantasy VIII or Final Fantasy X, which also used those incredibly cutting edge graphics, the beautiful pre-rendered FMVs. And when you think about where titles like FF8 or FF10 were at the time of their launch, they were the most technically impressive games that were out there, or at least among them. Even now, we have Final Fantasy XVI and its icon fights, which are these incredible spectacles, which cost a lot of money. I don't think there's any real stepping down at this point for FF, and Square Enix doesn't seem to be willing to step down either. So I do think that he is kind of telling the truth there, in that sense that Final Fantasy does have AAA in its DNA. In fact, Final Fantasy VII is often pointed to as the first AAA video game because of the insane amount of money spent. I believe it was the most expensive video game ever created at the time of its launch. And so just understanding that, you do realize that Final Fantasy almost has this obligation to be AAA. Should that be reevaluated maybe going forward? I think that is also a discussion worth having. But yeah, the reaction to it stepping down in any sort of way, I don't know how people would react to it. I don't imagine good. I think he has a point here. Jacob then continues saying, Square Enix attempted shorter, lower, cheaper new brands. That is how you got successes like the aforementioned Octopath Traveler, though nowhere near the revenue rate of an FF, and failures like Balan Wonderland, as well as mid-tiers like Foam Stars. It's hard to create new IP, to empower creators, to try new things. Many times there are failures, but we should not accuse Square Enix of not trying. They made many attempts and should be lauded for all their attempts, and instead they were shamed. If every game needed to be a 9 out of 10 for you to buy it, the problem is going to be exacerbated. When you purchase 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 games from a new IP, you help a publisher justify its investment into a better version of the next title. But the wallet voting here has been clear. People aren't buying 6 out of 10 games. Square Enix shouldn't try to make smaller, cheaper games unless they're 9 out of 10 quality or greater. And it turns out quality is really expensive, even for a smaller game like Alan Wake 2. To that end, FF as a brand cannot simply get smaller, be made better, be made cheaper, and still be FF. And frankly speaking, the lesson from my prior thread isn't being learned in responses that say FF specifically should be smaller or cheaper. Cost is not the problem. Sale and market size are the problem. We need to admit that a larger portion of players today prefer service games and are voting with their wallets and time, playing titles like Genshin Impact instead. I mean, this is what it really comes down to, guys, because we can scream all day that we prefer these single player complete experience games, but then when it comes down to it, if you're spending hundreds of dollars, thousands of dollars on Genshin Impact, if that's the game that you have 20,000 hours in, that's the message that the industry receives. And I'm not saying that shame on you for enjoying Genshin, or shame on you for enjoying Honkai or anything like that. But I mean, that's just the reality. Those games are going to continue to exist. I don't think we should protest them or shut them down or anything crazy like that. So please don't read it like that. But the simple fact of the matter is that the more that everyone, plays into service games, the more it continues to send the message to the industry that service game equals success, single player AAA complete game equals not success. And so the end result of that is always going to be that we should invest more into live service games. The numbers don't lie. You can say what you want to say all day long, but at the end of the day, where we put our money, where we put our time, is where things actually count. He says, it is plausible that if Sony released the numbers publicly, the lifetime revenue of Fortnite, Warzone, and GTA 5's online mode on PS5 would dwarf the combined total sales of the titles after them. Today, even first-party titles like The Last of Us are fodder to get you to buy a PS5 so that your service game of choice is played on a PlayStation instead of an Xbox. Fixed-price AAA titles that don't belong to the platform are going to be for smaller titles and for niche audiences to get the same level of quality they need to justify the purchase. Prices for third-party publishers will have to go up. We should not expect publicly traded AAA publishers to become AA publishers. Square Enix's efforts with Balan were to build new IP, but these new IP were never being counted on being the main driver of returns, because new IP and lower priced titles can't incrementally move the needle enough for a company at Square Enix's size. They were seeds for the future that failed to bloom. Public game publishers will thus continue to place their main bets on the side of the market they can influence the most, AAA, while gamers should look to indies and smaller publishers for their AA hits because expectations from consumers and investors are different between the two. The real puzzle to me, which I hinted at in the previous thread, is why someone other than Square Enix made Genshin Impact. That should have been their market to capture. Expect creating a similar title to be a major focus the next few years. Again, whenever you look at the market objectively, the fact that Square Enix were not the first ones to create a competitor to Genshin Impact, not even that, the fact that they were second in general to create something like Genshin Impact. Final Fantasy should have been there first. And in some ways, they did try to experiment with this idea of creating a AAA mobile experience. They did this with a title called Mobius Final Fantasy. And Mobius had console quality graphics on a phone. It was incredible. I mean, this thing looked like a PS3 game and ran on my iPhone 6, which doesn't really sound too impressive now, but at the time, that was incredibly impressive. And instead of pushing forward in that way, it seems like they've continued to make more traditional, smaller mobile gachas rather than anything bigger. It should have been Square to be the first ones to take that risk. And now Square is going to be in a sea of other people trying to compete to make something like Genshin. But it's just such a shame because Square was the most primed one to be able to make that. And I imagine they're going to try to do something within the next few years. However, I do see it potentially being a problem because they are going to have so much more competition whenever they finally do enter this market. He then says, so I return to the problem is that the FF brand was not selling what the product's budget needed it to be. Part of this is going to be resolved by going multi-platform, and part of the problem is simply greater competition that isn't recoverable from. Today, Final Fantasy XIV and free-to-play mobile titles are subsidizing the fixed-price titles, further indicating where consumers are willing to spend the time in money within the Square Enix family of titles. Yeah, Final Fantasy XIV, a service title as an MMO. And people are spending at an individual level thousands of hours on that game, and they're paying a monthly sub, and they're buying the expansions. And so from a business perspective, yeah, dude, service title, right? It just keeps making sense business-wise. Next, a recurring theme that I saw in discourse on the prior thread was with regards to game being art and capitalism. I'll note that the context of the original thread was statements made by Square Enix, a publicly traded company, on their annual financial results. A public company, unless its mission statement is otherwise, has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders. This includes Japanese firms. There was a time where some Japanese public companies cared less about the share price in the name of employment, but the lifetime employment system broke down after the bubble collapsed in the 90s. Square Enix shareholders include Enix founder Fukushima-san, several major Japanese banks, Vanguard, my own company's 401k, JP Morgan Chase, and the public investment fund PIF of Saudi Arabia, and many more. PIF has a large enough holding to have board of representation. When a bank like JP Morgan gives you interest on your savings account, it does so from profits it receives by holding shares in companies like Square Enix. Similarly, when Japanese banks invest into Square Enix, they do so with the deposits of their customers. Financial systems are deeply intertwined. It is the responsibility of the company to generate the best return it can in order to fulfill its obligations to its shareholders. By definition, many companies will not surpass the average rate of return of the stock market. And by definition, many companies do surpass. The better the company performs, the higher its shares go, and the more it can afford to reinvest. If a public company intentionally sets its budgets to underperform the stock market returns, it would have a harder time raising money, servicing debt, and in turn sustaining its employees. This does not mean that the company will not hit its financial goals, but it does mean that in general, public companies must seek better returns. The company may alternatively focus on growth or dividends or other financial goals as it fits the business and its sector. Additionally, shareholders elect board members who control the budgets and can hire and fire the CEO. In other words, the CEO of Square Enix reports to its board, who report to its shareholders, who seek greater returns on investment. This is the case for many public companies without alternative mission statements. This does not mean that games aren't art or creativity aren't important to their businesses. It does not mean that public companies, be it Electronic Arts, Take-Two, Capcom, Nexon, or otherwise, generally build games to generate returns on investment. Note that beating the stock market on a per-dollar basis was only an example of a way to determine a baseline, conservative return on investment. In fact, most times the return on investment for a publisher like Take-Two needs to be substantially higher than just stock market return baselines. There are, of course, non-public game publishers. Valve is one, Epic is another. You also have studios like Larian, which have been able to remain independent. These companies can determine what's important for their returns their own way, without the same pressures of public companies. They produce a lot of amazing products. Public companies cannot behave the same way as private companies. The resulting industry. Publicly traded AAA game publishers will focus on fewer titles with a combination of live service, microtransactions, that is, an FF version of Genshin, and a higher price point fixed price, Call of Duty, GTA, Final Fantasy, in the $70 to $150 range. Are you guys ready for the $150 video game? Because that's what's coming. The mid-tier is the domain of independent developers and smaller publishers at the $30 to $60 price point. And third, live service titles will increasingly platformize and offer UGC tools. Expect this to be part of GTA. So this is kind of the unfortunate reality, you guys. Service games are dominating the industry right now, and everyone wants one because they generate so much money. They generate more money than pretty much any individual console release can ever even dream of. And they do so in perpetuity, which is something that definitely single releases aren't going to be able to do. And if they try to, then it'll just be microtransactions and DLC, which eventually turns it into a service title of sorts. And so when you look at it from this perspective, video game prices are going to go up. $70 is nowhere near the ceiling. As he mentions here, $150 is the type of range that we can see. $100 plus even for GTA 6, as that's currently rumored, because that might actually exceed the current $70 baseline. So when we talk about these insane costs, one thing that does come to people's mind is the potential utilization of AI. And Jacob was asked about that. He was asked, do you believe that this situation will accelerate the usage of AI tools to reduce cost and speed up development time? Eventually, AI tools will get to the point where they can speed up the development process greatly and only really require a skeleton crew. I'm saying this because based on factors affecting the rest of the entertainment industry, movies and animation can and will use AI to lessen the production of these, and only really need a small team. AI will be the great equalizers of movie and animations. Do you believe it would apply to games? Jacob then replied, I'm rather skeptical on AI tools helping in a visible horizon, meaning a set period of time where I understand industry direction, because a good FF director is authorship and demands control. I can't imagine FF directors I know being willing to let an AI do enough that it would save $50 million in development. To that end, most of the things AI can do right now, 2D art, text, are some of the cheapest parts of games and generally aren't worth any of the headaches or copyright issues involved in AI. At best right now, AI can generate maybe icons for a menu or like some early concepts, but it is not able to generate anywhere near playable video game assets. So the idea that AI could be used anytime soon, or even probably this generation in an incredibly aggressive way, probably is not happening. AI is advancing fast, and so I may have to eat that statement soon, but at the current moment, that's not what's going to be happening, and I don't see that happening at least the next 2 or 3 years across the rest of this generation. I think you may be getting to see some of that in the next generation for sure, but it still may even be a while out before, we're really seeing this style of game being made. And ultimately, I agree with what he's saying. It's really hard for me to imagine, like a Yoshi P, a Tetsuya Nomura, like really just doing like an AI generated game, especially when these are people who are so particular about even the work that their human beings, their actual workers are doing for them. It is incredibly hard for me to imagine that Yoshi P or Nomura is just gonna, be like, yeah, it's whatever, man. The AI, Stable Diffusion, just pumped this out. It's great. We're just going to put this in the game. That's not the type of guys they are. I can't imagine a Hideo Kojima doing that either. It's Japan in particular, authorship is kind of a big deal there, even more so in the West. And yeah, it's just very hard for me to imagine that being a thing for them, that they would let go of the creative control for that. And dude, we love their games in part because they have that level of control and because they believe that every single detail should matter in an incredibly crucial and incredibly important way, and have like this intricate design to them. So I don't think that's something that we necessarily want. Another great question here. A great addendum to your last thread, thank you. As the scope of competition is making it harder to raise sale prices to any useful extent, I wonder if and how AAA dev model can be sustained. Sounds absurd, but can you even justify to shareholders making FF anymore? Just to clarify, as someone who loves games in general and FF in particular, this does make me sad. While the industry as a whole focusing on the wrong things undoubtedly made cost balloon, I still like playing games that 1 million people worked on. Jacob replied, FF14 shows that people will continuously pay for a good experience. So the problem with package disc/fixed price games is that you only get a one-time hit income that radically decreases from the day it goes on sale, which is to say, a few weeks in and discounts and used discs start to eat revenue really fast. If the audience is willing to pay more for a 100-hour FF, it can make up for the missing audience. Basically, if they charged $150 for FF16 instead of $70 and still had 3 million users, they can make back their requirements from the first week's sales. That's a big initial pay from a consumer. But if you look at what an FF14 player pays over a lifetime, it's a fraction, and relative to inflation, it's also just really charging for games what they were costing in the 90s. That's true. I mean, many people will be quick to point out to you that games were like $70 in the 90s, which once you factor in inflation, that's about what it'd be costing now. As much as people say that video games are more expensive now, they're actually cheaper. They've retained that fixed price for a really long time. I think a better argument to be made in that specific case is that people aren't making proportionally enough money. I think that's the real issue, but I think that requires an entirely different video on an entirely different channel to discuss those issues. So ultimately, live service free-to-play games have put AAA console games in a very tough place. It is really hard to say where the future of AAA video games is going at this point, but right now, it is looking like price increases are the way that it is going to continue to sustain itself. That and shoving more microtransactions into your games. The service game trend is not going to be a trend. It is going to keep happening. Video game publishers, unfortunately, are going to continue to force developers to pump out even more service games. It sucks. But everyone wants a service game because that is what the trend line is suggesting. That is where we're putting our money. I'm guilty too. I love Final Fantasy 14, but I also want all these other games to be able to survive in a big way. I wholeheartedly believe in the value of a complete package title, and I hope that everyone else does too, regardless of how many service games that are out there. As Jacob said, we vote with our time in our wallets, and ultimately, what we spend the most time and money on is what we're going to get more of. And currently, as an industry, we spend the most of our time and money on Genshin and Fortnite. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below, and I will see you guys all in the next video. Later, guys.